Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alistair Stevens, and tonight we conclude our unit on horror literature in general, I guess, just the whole of horror literature as seen through the prism that is Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula. This is our 8th session out of what was supposed to be a 4-session unit, and we still have a lot to cover. So I'm going to move into this pretty quickly, and I'm sorry, I'm bleeding audio through my recording here, which is absolutely no good. So I apologize for that, because this has been an evening of technical interruptions. I'll just take a moment here, just right up front, to acknowledge that broadcasting over the internet is a precarious business. If only we had the illusion of good, robust, reliable Victorian modernity. You know, if only we had some kind of steam-powered system of pipes or some kind of, locomotive that ran on tracks by which we might broadcast live to the internet, then things would be much more reliable. Things would be much more efficacious, much more efficient for sure, and I'd be able to slay all of the vampires that crossed my path. As it is, we make do with this ramshackle infrastructure that we call YouTube. Let's get into tonight's discussion, shall we? And this is going to be a slightly atypical episode of Stars and Swords, partly because the last third-ish of Dracula is very different to what comes before, right? We reach a real turning point with the final dispatch of Lucy Westermer, and what follows thereafter seems tonally different. It is in many ways a recapitulation of what Stoker has done through the first 2/3 of the novel. We're kind of returning to some of the same ideas. Some of those same ideas will not be the same, by the way. Some of them will vary really quite noticeably from one instantiation to the next. We're going to have the opportunity to talk a little about what Dracula is and how Dracula works and what Dracula is capable of doing under certain circumstances. We'll get to cover some of that in tonight's reading, though not by any means all of it, because Van Helsing loves to go over the same material again and again, though I am not one to talk. What's most interesting about this, though, is that we lose some of our tension, certainly, right? The threads of plot which remain following the dispatch of Lucy Westermer are not as tightly wound as they were before, and I think that we lose a certain momentum. Certainly, as I've observed in previous sessions here in this unit, we're going to spend some time on the shoe leather. We're going to spend some time on the proceduralism, on the rationalism. We're going to spend some time on being good Victorian gentlemen, conducting ourselves with good Victorian values and a good Victorian rationality, right? We're going to spend a lot of time figuring out where we go next and what we do next in order to hunt down the vampire. But we also see this tonal shift. We also see a movement into more explicit dramatic irony. And there is a real conscious repositioning of the text with regard to the reader. We'll get into that. I think that particularly to the contemporary reader, right? Even to the contemporary reader, there's now little mystery left in this book because Dracula has been exposed. We have seen him at his worst, and more than that even, we now know what he is really capable of, and to an extent, what his game plan is. We know why he is in London, and we know what the next phase of his afterlife, his undeath, will look like if he has his way, because we've seen what happened to Lucy. So even to the contemporary reader, and certainly to the modern reader who has an understanding of what vampires are and what they're for anyway, right? Even to the contemporary reader, the mystery has now kind of gone. And in the absence of that mystery, we are seeing these different perspectives play out. It's another way in which Stoker leverages the strength of the epistolary novel, kind of cracks open the epistolary novel to create spaces within it for dramatic irony. For those of you joining me for perhaps the first time, because I feel like I mentioned this in most units that we do here on Stars and Swords, dramatic irony is that moment when the audience is aware of something which the characters within the text are not aware of, right? Which they remain blissfully ignorant. So that creates a tension. It creates a push-pull with the text, between the text and the reader. And we're certainly going to see that as we move through, right? Particularly with Mina. Let's not be coy. Let's not play games here. Particularly with Mina, because Mina is going to be very aware of what is happening. But even prior to that, we are going to see, well, the proof of a recapitulation of the Lucy plot, I guess. Let's get into it, because as I say, we've got so very much to cover. And we'll begin by beginning with chapter 18 here. Mina, fascinated by Seward's account of the mysterious Mr. Renfield, again, leveraging this idea that the characters within this book are all up to date with this book. They have all done the necessary reading. They are very familiar with the text as it's presented to us, too. And Mina has read this book and gone, wow, this Mr. Renfield seems fascinating. So she goes off to visit him. And if that sounds like maybe we're lacking a certain narrative thrust here, if we're maybe lacking a certain narrative momentum, it's because we are, right? We'll get that narrative momentum back in the near future. But right now, we're just kind of taking care of some business. Renfield is surprising, though. He neatly composes himself, consuming all the many flies and spiders within his little cell before settling in to talk to Mina and revealing that the lunatics of the asylum, again, loaded Victorian words, they all have an interest in the life of Dr. Seward. This is the slide here. Quote, "You will, of course, understand, Mrs. Harker, that when a man is so loved and honoured as our host is, everything regarding him is of interest to our little community. Dr. Seward is loved not only by his household and his friends, but even by his patients who, being some of them hardly in mental equilibrium, are apt to distort causes and effects. Since I myself have been an inmate of a lunatic asylum, I cannot but notice the sophistic tendencies of some of its inmates lean toward the errors of non causae and ignoratio elenchi." I positively opened my eyes at this new development. Here was my own pet lunatic, the most pronounced of his type that I have ever met with, talking elemental philosophy, and with the manner of a polished gentleman. I wonder if it was Mrs. Harker's presence which had touched some chord in his memory, if this new phase was spontaneous or in any way due to her unconscious influence. She must have some rare gift or power. This, of course, in the voice of Dr. Seward, who is giving us this personal account, as if you can guess that from the somewhat appalling note that Renfield is his own pet lunatic, the most pronounced of his type, of course. So, well, we'll talk a little about Renfield here and Renfield's tragic arc through the rest of the story in just a moment, but I want to pull out what is absolutely the introduction of a dominant theme in the last third of this book. What has been, to some extent, a secondary or even tertiary theme throughout the book, but really now comes into its ascendancy, and it's weird that we give it to Renfield to voice. Sophia is the Greek goddess of wisdom, and though thus her adherents are sophists, right? Her followers are those who believe in the power of wisdom and argumentation, right? Particularly this one kind of wise man, this learned man, this man who can argue any point and make it compelling. And because clever men care for nothing so much as their own cleverness, they argue just as often to obscure the truth as to reveal it. Argumentation, to the sophist, becomes a kind of game. Socrates then slices through this. He is the sword of Alexander to this person, to this Gordian knot of argumentation here, and he redefines sophistry as explicitly a kind of misleading and twisty and deceitful and self-serving and bad faith series of logical arguments engaged in by people who are, let us generously say, primarily interested in demonstrating their own intellectual superiority rather than a pursuit of the truth. And oftentimes, that is not even the goal, right? It is for financial gain. It is for political gain. It is for the gain of some kind of power, right? It is this warped and deceitful type of argumentation that has nothing to do with the truth and everything to do with the process of logical deduction. You can build an argument about anything, and I'll give you a moment to bathe in the irony that I am currently at least broadcasting this on YouTube. Because there is a temptation, right? Not to descend into the mire of modern politics, but there is a temptation to believe that we live in a sophistic age, that this is an era of veiled truth and only the most spurious of correlations, right? And we do, I think it's fair to say, live in such an age, though perhaps it is not as novel or unique as it seems to be. I think that no age of human civilization and culture has ever been as unique as the people who lived within that age believed it to be, but certainly we're at a height of public and shameless sophistry, right? And it is worth remembering that as these superficially convincing chains of logical thought are constructed right in front of us with the intent of leading us into dark places, that there are people who delight in this obfuscation of the truth, that we have resources. There are ways of cutting through this. We can follow in the footsteps of Socrates. We can school ourselves in the logical fallacies. We can learn to identify them as the useful and efficient rhetorical strategies that they are and learn to see through them. We can discipline ourselves with a certain clarity of thought, right? This is what Renfield is introducing here. Two, in fact, of the formal logical fallacies. The non causae, the questionable cause, and the ignoratio elenchi, which means it literally means the ignoring of refutation, right? But it is actually the fallacy of the irrelevant conclusion. That is to say, X is Y. X and Y are connected and correlated, and therefore X causes Y, right? This is not necessarily true. This is the questionable cause takes this form. We'll talk about the irrelevant conclusion in just a moment. The questionable cause takes the form of X and Y are correlated, thus X causes Y. Of course, we are familiar with this from this useful graph, which was published by Forbes back in 2012, a brilliant article written by Erica Anderson, the link to which will be in the show notes. As you can see from this helpful graph, it demonstrates the obviously true statement that global warming has risen as the number of pirates in the world has decreased. Therefore, we can draw the conclusion that pirates prevented climate change. And by inference, if we want to reverse the damage done by human industry to our environment, we simply need to foster piracy. We need to encourage the ranks of pirates to swell, to return to a 17th century kind of volume, thus undoing all the damage of climate change. This is obviously a silly example. All of these examples are silly. That's the notion of a spurious connection. I will actually link out to oh my goodness, what is his name? Tyler Vignan, I believe is his name, who does the Spurious Connections website, where there are thousands of examples of this type of thing. I will link out to that too, where you can go and while away a depressing afternoon looking at connections of a series of graphs which just happen to overlap. But to keep this podcast even vaguely on topic, it is important to understand why these questionable causes, these correlations are so common, why they are so easy to believe, why it is a trap that is so easily laid for even the intelligent reader, right? It is very, very easy to set up a fake correlation and convince people that it is true. And it comes down to this: the world is chaos. And I don't just mean today, I mean all the time. Since human beings have been human beings, the world is chaos. We are besieged every second of the day by more information than we can possibly process. And I'm not talking about YouTube streams or social media streams or flat screens on every possible surface. I'm talking about just the deluge of information that comes in through our senses, right? Everything we see and hear and taste and touch and smell, everything that we are experiencing in the world, that is so much raw data that we cannot possibly process all of it in real time. Thus, our brain has become an incredibly efficient means of discerning patterns and making connections, right? That is a survival instinct that we have. It is a survival mechanism that is absolutely necessary to the continued existence of the human being, is that we can draw these conclusions very quickly and deftly, and thereby either prioritize things which are dangerous to us or dismiss things which we think are not dangerous to us. There is a bang from behind me as I am recording. Is it more likely that a book has fallen off the shelf, or is it more likely that, armed men are bursting through the front door of my home and are ready to drag me away to some political prison for espousing terrible thoughts about literature? It's possible. It's possible that the latter is true, but the former is far more likely, so I'm not going to waste the emotional and physical energy processing the latter, right? If I go out to the forest and I eat some delicious looking mushrooms and then I get real sick, it's probably because of the mushrooms, right? That is a connection. That is a correlation that I can draw that will enable me to survive in the future and not, eat forest mushrooms as often. So we're programmed to make these connections, even though we now live in a world where the breadth of information available to us makes those connections much less substantial, much less likely to be true, much more likely to be a reflection of our underlying moral philosophy, of our own prejudices. And this is where we hook back into Dracula. This is why I believe that Stoker is spending so much time on this, right? This idea of prejudice has been in the book basically from the beginning. This is the drum that Van Helsing keeps on beating. This is why he builds these chains of logical argument to convince Seward that in fact, vampires, you guys, the idea that we are blinded to what is possible through our belief that it is simply impossible is now going to be the most important theme for most of the rest of the book, right? Right at the end, we're going to segue back into modernity, modernism versus the older world. We'll talk about that in, an hour's time, probably. But for now, we're going to spend a lot of time thinking about these types of correlations, these types of conclusions, and how they limit us, and what that says about Stoker's take on Victorian rationalism, on logical deduction as a virtue and as an intellectual discipline, right? When Seward marvels at Renfield's ability to identify these elementary building blocks of philosophy, the reader should, I think, be aware of this echo of Van Helsing pointing at Seward and kind of seeing the same thing. Remember these chains that he builds out when he's trying to convince Seward about Lucy, when he's trying to convince Seward about Dracula, right? He builds them building blocks, one after the other. If you concede that this is true, then therefore is this not also true? Yes. If those are both true, then is this not also true? This is how we build a logical argument. This is how we engage in a kind of good-hearted sophistry. And since we spent some time on questionable cause there, let us also spend some time on the irrelevant conclusion. The irrelevant conclusion is the logical fallacy, which says that I guess person A, parent A says vegetables are good for you, and child B replies, but I don't like the way that vegetables taste. That is not a refutation of the original point, right? The refutation of the original point would be vegetables are not good for you. That is not a position that you can adopt. So therefore you argue something that is irrelevant. But if you argue something that is irrelevant with enough power, if you argue something that is irrelevant with enough fortitude, with enough assumed moral authority, sometimes you can bluff people into thinking that you have in fact refuted their point. Irrelevant conclusions are, I think, even now, in the era of but her emails, right? Irrelevant conclusions are still less rhetorically effective than questionable causes. I think it's easier to see through a irrelevant conclusion. But they do also reveal a lot about the underlying assumptions of the person who is making that irrelevant conclusion, right? Who is choosing not to refute that thing. Someone like, for example, Dr. John Seward. Let's get back to what Renfield was saying, in fact, so that we can take a closer look at this. He was my own pet lunatic, the most pronounced of his type that I ever met, with talking elemental philosophy and with the manner of a polished gentleman. I wonder if it was Mrs. Harker's presence which had touched some chord in his memory. Whoa! It was Mrs. Harker's presence? I mean, let it be stated for the record, as I'm going to repeat, 17 times in the course of tonight's session, we all love Mina Harker. Mina Harker is fantastic. But why on earth would you assume that this correlation was true? And this is not me just taking John Seward to task, right? This is clearly intentional. As all of the narrative momentum has been lost in the novel Dracula by Bram Stoker, we suddenly pivot out to Renfield offering up this logical fallacy, and then Seward engaging in exactly that logical fallacy. I was going to say in the next paragraph, but as you can see here from the slide, not even in the next paragraph. Right there. This is opening up this space for dramatic irony, as I was saying before, right? It's so clear. It's so immediate. It's almost a little, comedic skit. Behold our scene in which a lunatic converses on the subject of the logical fallacies with his doctor, while this educated and accomplished fellow demonstrates exactly that variety of sophistic vanity, right? How droll, how sophisticated you are, Mr. Stoker. And this isn't, it's not completely fair. Hey, the silly thing that I just did, not completely fair, it turns out, because Stoker isn't just being witty. It is part of this underlying theme of rationality, because, again, it is vital to understand that what Stoker is doing in the pages of Dracula is not condemning this type of logical process. He is not condemning Victorian rationality, capital V, capital R, right? Instead, he is pointing out that there are limits to it. There are traps that can be set for the logical mind that need to be acknowledged and overcome. By now, there's so much evidence of Renfield's strangeness, right? Seward, as I was saying, as we came in, right? Mina has read the account. That is why she is interested in Renfield. It's no coincidence that Stoker references this. He brings it up to remind us that John Seward has also read the account. He is just as familiar with these collected materials, with the book that we have read, as Mina Harker is, and yet he's not putting the pieces together. He's not looking at the vagaries, the ebb and flow of Renfield's personality, of Renfield's character. He's not thinking about Carfax Abbey right next door. He's not putting the pieces together. He's blind to it. And that is a kind of logical fallacy. Here, as he's drawing this spurious correlation between Mrs. Harker's presence and Renfield's newfound intellect. Turns out that Seward is bad at his job. And this is thrown into even sharper relief, if it needed to be thrown into even sharper relief, by the arrival of Van Helsing and the beginning of the plan, the root of the plan to destroy the Count Dracula, without, of course, the help of Mina. This is going to be another element that we are going to return to again and again. This is not even the last time that Van Helsing himself is going to have this conversation in tonight's reading. Quote, "Ah, that wonderful Madam Mina. She has man's brain, a brain that a man should have if he were much gifted, and a woman's heart. The good God fashioned her for a purpose, believe me, when he made that so good combination. Friend John, up to now, fortune has made that woman of help to us. After tonight, she must not have to do with this so terrible affair. It is not good that she run a risk so great. We men are determined, nay, are we not pledged to destroy this monster? But it is no part for a woman. Even if she be not harmed, her heart may fail her in so much and so many horrors, and hereafter she may suffer both in waking from her nerves and in sleep from her dreams, and besides she is young woman and not so long married, there may be other things to think of some time, if not now. You tell me she has wrote all, and she must consult with us, but tomorrow she say goodbye to this work, and we go alone. To parse out just a little bit of that, we're going to spend a little bit of time on this slide, but to parse out, for those of you who are so delightfully naive that you may not follow exactly what Van Helsing says, besides she is young woman and not so long married, there may be other things to think of sometime, if not now. She might get pregnant. She might have children. And of course, that is going to be a primary concern. And that's not pulled out of nowhere, because remember the emphasis that we put on Lucy's perversion of maternal femininity that we discussed in last week's session, right? So for the serial reader, as we're moving through the book, these two thoughts are very close beside one another, even though we have taken a week off in between. I want to credit, actually, before we move too deep into here, I want to credit the excellent Leslie Skipa, hello Skipa, longtime listener and friend, for catching something really interesting here. The repeated phrase, Madame Mina, could be rendered in Italian as Madamina, which is to say little lady, which is, on the one hand, like, so delightful, so terrible. It's so awful that I can't help but be just a little bit, like, enchanted by it. It's, I don't think deliberate, but it is very lovely. It's so much more obnoxious than even the use of little girl, right, to describe both Lucy and Mina, which is also terrible, and obviously patriarchal and condescending, and all of these classic Victorian stereotypes. But there is something about, Madamina, little madam, is just so gross. Interestingly, the word Madamina is a real word with a fascinating history. It's coined by Lorenzo di Ponti in 1787 as part of the libretto for the Mozart opera Don Giovanni, right? Madamina here is a deliberate and conscious fusion of Italian and French to mean a woman who is caught between. She is not a girl or a woman. She is not a maid or a wife or a mother. She is something in between. I don't think that this is in any way intentional, but I did a little research on it this afternoon. I'll actually link out, there's a excellent bit of interpretive etymology performed by Timothy Hampton entitled The Most Beautiful Word, with reference exclusively to Don Giovanni. So that link will also be in the show notes. It's pretty great. I'm kind of fond of it, I must admit. So let's look at what Van Helsing has to say here. That wonderful Madame Mina, she has man's brain, a brain that man should have if he was much gifted, right? So not just a man's brain, but like a really good man's brain, like as good as any man. If he were much gifted, he'd be lucky to have a brain like Mina's. And she has a woman's heart. The good God fashioned her for a purpose, believe me, when he made that so good combination. Mina's just fantastic, right? A genuine respect from Van Helsing toward Mina Harker, as we would demand, right? As we would be disappointed if we didn't see that from Van Helsing. This idea, though, that good God fashioned her for a purpose, believe me, when he made that so good combination. So therefore, right, she is as good as a gifted man, and she has a woman's heart. She possesses that which no other member of this little Scooby gang has. So she should obviously sit things out. Why should she sit things out? Because women aren't up to this, right? We are determined, nay, are we not pledged to destroy this monster? But it is no part for a woman. Even if she be not harmed, her heart may fail her in much and so many horrors, and afterwards she might suffer, right? This is spurious. This is an indefensible conclusion, in a way, right? Is there an ability here to move through all the horrors that has been demonstrated by literally any man, right? Out of the group that we have here? Not really. I don't think that's, I'm saying, hands up everyone in this room who hasn't had a nervous breakdown following all that they've seen. Jonathan spent a month in hospital in Budapest after facing the horrors of Dracula's castle. Van Helsing breaks down himself, right? We're going to call back later in tonight's reading. Harker is going to believe that Van Helsing is I think we're in Seward's POV in that moment. Seward is going to believe that Van Helsing is on the brink of another breakdown, like the one he had before, when his All the Devils at Once speech kind of rounds out that scene. Arthur has obviously gone through it. He perhaps has more reason than most to go through it. But you know who has been rock solid this whole time? It's the marvelous Mrs. Mina. She's just been terrific from the jump. So this is a false conclusion. This is an indefensible bit of deduction, and it is caused by prejudice. It is caused by blindness, right? There's no deductive process here that gets us to Mina needs to sit this one out. The thing that gets us to Mina needs to sit this one out is bias. That's all it is. In fact, I want to pull up an email that I received this morning from Travis, who, thank you so much for your email, Travis. It was great. Travis writes, in fact, I'm going to quote this in its entirety. Quote, I was hoping you could help me tease apart what the book is trying to say through the treatment of women in the story. On the one hand, Mina is, with the debatable exception of Van Helsing, far and away the most capable character in the book. Despite this, all of the male characters, even while they are praising her resourcefulness, try to keep information from her to protect her, quote, delicate female sensibilities, not to mention all the other female characters in the story. It's also clear that there are negative consequences ranging from slight to catastrophic because these women were kept in the dark, by my count, Travis says, at least 10 times. And I think the book is aware of this irony. But despite this, the novel never seems to condemn the men for keeping the women or the women from keeping each other in the dark. Quite the opposite, in fact. The novel seems to agree that the men were in the right for shielding these potentially scary facts from the women in their lives. I would really appreciate your thoughts on this. Bram Stoker equals radical feminist? Question mark, exclamation point, question mark. Thank you for your excellent email, Travis. Short answer, yes. Long answer, it's complicated, but yes. I'm hesitant to get into this too casually. I'm hesitant to sink too quickly into these choppy waters because I should acknowledge that there is an absolute lack of a coherent academic consensus on this subject. Dracula is a weird lightning rod in literary studies. Partly, I think, and this thought really did just come to me today as I was wondering why it is that Dracula is such a football to be possessed and carried and owned and spiked by various kind of different segments of the academic community. Let me come back to my camera here. And I think that it's actually a function of the epistolary form. I think that the epistolary form puts all of the action in a very immediate past, right? If not an outright present, right? We're fudging it because these people are writing down the fact afterwards, but actually we're very close to the action. So what we're getting is immediacy. We're not getting broader accounts of characters and relationships, right? One example of this is the fairly certain speculation that Mina was at some point Lucy's teacher / governess, right? That accounts for them knowing each other. It accounts for their close friendship, but also the huge difference in their social standing. You'll remember Mina talking about this very early in the novel when she's talking about marrying Jonathan, the relative wealth of the Westenra family. But the details of their history and their relationship and even to some extent their character outside that which we see deliberately and directly on the page, all of that's kind of unclear, which gives us a huge amount of space for interpretive work. It gives us a ton of space for queer readings, for feminist readings, for anti-feminist readings, for sexualized readings, for asexualized readings, for commentary on kink and the kink community, for repression, for alienation, for Freudianism, for Victorian concepts of female virginity and sexual availability and desirability even, right? And that's before we get even into the relationships between men, which are just as loaded, which are just as full and varied, right? Anyone can find anything in this book. If you want to make an argument about the Victorian world, about Victorian literature, about Victorian society, you can probably make that argument using Dracula because, in a way, and I don't say this is a condemnation of the novel, right? I think it's actually part of Stoker's purpose here. Dracula, the novel, is kind of a hollow object. It has space within it to carry whatever speculation you want to fill it with. The only readings I think that I'm completely resistant to are those readings which are kind of bad faith readings, right? To go back to our points about logical fallacies and sophistry. Bad faith readings that deliberately try to misconstrue commonplace Victorian custom and courtesy, which is attested in 1,000 books and untold numbers of historical documents too, as being more sexual or romantic. There are romantic reads on all of this too. that just deliberately and in bad faith misread Victorian culture and society in order to generate a kind of romantic tension or a kind of sexual tension there. Not that that's a bad thing, go nuts by all means, but I don't think that it's valid interpretation, right? The other one that I really don't get and I don't support is any kind of allegation that this book condemns Lucy or Mina for their sexual activity, right? Huge scare quotes around that. Mina, as we will see later, experiences a moment of self-doubt, but the book doesn't give that moment of self-doubt or kind of self-castigation almost, right? Of shame almost. The book doesn't give that any more weight than it gives Jonathan's very similar moment of self-consciousness and shame when he's confronted by the vampire brides back in Transylvania at the very beginning of the book. The Stoker, I think, almost consciously treats those two things with very similar weight here. So I'm not really at home to any kind of interpretation that, I say this, someone could write this tomorrow and I would be completely swayed by it because that's, the academy. That's how scholarship works in general, I suppose. But up to this point, I have never seen a convincing argument that suggests that the book is slut-shaming, for want of a better term, Lucy or Mina, that it is in any way preoccupied with them being, scandalously defiled by their association, by their physical association with Dracula. Lucy and Mina experience terrible, literally horrific things, and the book treats them, I think, pretty consistently with an appropriate weight and condemnation, even if the characters are kind of pushing back against that and experiencing moments of self-doubt. The narrative voice, such as, and this is a little tricky too, because of course in an epistolary novel, the narrative voice, the author function kind of presides over all the accounts evenly. It kind of weaves between the accounts in order to generate the perspective of the book as a whole versus the perspective of any given individual in that moment, right? That's kind of how this documentary form works. But still, I don't think that those are valid readings. I'm not saying that you couldn't make a valid reading, but I haven't seen one to date. All of that is to say that what comes next on the subject of feminism in Bram Stoker's Dracula is going to be more so than even anything else that I say on this podcast, right? My own opinion. This is my interpretation of the book, and I'm not really offering this perspective as a refutation of any other valid perspective. This is how I read it, and I'm very interested to read any disagreements. I will recommend, in fact, firstly, I will recommend, if you disagree, please do get in touch. Stars and Swords pod, at gmail.com is my email address. You can reach me there, and I'd love to talk about different perspectives on this novel, because that's the fun of the whole thing, right? But I will also recommend, not because I completely agree with it in its entirety, but because I think it's a very fine piece of writing and it does function as a kind of gloss for some of these subjects. There's an article entitled Vampiric Affinities, Mina Harker and the Paradox of Femininity in Bram Stoker's Dracula. It was published in 2005 in the Victorian Literature and Culture Journal by Charles Prescott and Grace Giorgio. I'll include the link to that in the show notes. A good read. It's, 30 pages, something like that, but pretty accessible. It is an academic paper, so, be mindful of that. It will take some attention, but I do think that it glosses some of these subjects very nicely and gives a real breadth of interpretation, even if I don't agree with everything that they drill down to. So with all of that said, let's get into it. The feminist argument for Mina is what the last third of this novel is for. This is my take here, right? This is really what the next part of the book is about, is repositioning Mina as not just a strong, capable woman, not just an exceptional woman, but as somebody who is undervalued, undertrusted, and unseen by her friends and cohorts, right? By her lovers and admirers here. And I want to contrast, I guess, a little bit the Mina story with the Lucy story, because the Lucy story trades, as I mentioned back at the beginning of tonight's session, right? The Lucy story trades on horror and on mystery, particularly for the contemporary reader, but I think even really now for the modern reader. It is horrific, it is mysterious, we don't really know what is happening to Lucy Westenra, and as it unfolds, the full magnitude of it is just awful, right? The plot there carries us forward because we don't know where we're going. But having seen it all happen to Lucy, we now know where we're going with Mina. So the Mina plot is necessarily different, right? We, and to some extent the characters in the book, understand what the stakes are, forgive the pun, and understand why it is important. We're paying attention to the right things here which we maybe weren't paying attention to in the Lucy story because we didn't know to pay attention to them. That is where we get this refocusing on procedural work, but it is also where we get the refocusing on dramatic irony, right? Mixed, of course, with a lot of shoe leather, a lot of good, solid Victorian deductive work, and the tracking of the Count's safe houses all across the city of London. Let's sketch out the story, and then we'll take a look at exactly what I'm talking about. Because Mina is a fragile woman, per Van Helsing, because Mina is just a fragile woman who could not possibly face the danger of Dracula, she's left at the asylum while the men conduct their investigations. The hunt, perhaps, might be a better word. While there, of course, she is bitten by Dracula, who is admitted to the asylum by Renfield. Just tragic. Just a tragic, awful arc for Renfield that actually hit me very powerful. I guess Renfield is one of those characters who I have really gained a new appreciation for through this reading, through paying close attention. And unfortunately, we're just not going to be able to spend as much time on Renfield as I would like to tonight. We're not really going to be able to delve into the detail of his story here, but it is just awful and tragic, and really does, I think, play into that notion of the miasmatic influence, right? This just corruption of Dracula that takes this. Well, I suppose the degree to which he is an innocent soul is certainly up for debate, but takes this man and twists him. So, and we'll see too, from the end of his life, how he strives even then for redemption. There's a nobility to Renfield in these closing moments that I think is usually lost. It usually shakes out of any particular adaptation of this text. Certainly, I've just been watching the Coppola 1992 Bram Stoker's Dracula, and you guys, I love Tom Waits, but it's not this. It's not this character. It's a different character who's extremely entertaining. It's one of my favorite performances in the entire film, but it's not this. Anyway, Mina is bitten by Dracula 3 times. The last time, well, we'll look at the last time in some detail in the minutes to come. But first, we're going to take a look at 3 separate instances, right? These are 3 split accounts, all by Jonathan Harker, demonstrating his ignorance, demonstrating the fact that he is not seeing the signs. Quote, I went with the party to the search with an easy mind, for I think I never saw Mina so absolutely strong and well. I am glad she consented to hold back and let us men do the work. Somehow it was a dread to me that she was in this fearful business at all, but now that her work is done, and that it is due to her energy and brains and foresight that the whole story is put together in such a way that every point tells, she may well feel her part is finished, and she can henceforth leave the rest to us. So that's the first excerpt here, this first partial excerpt. I'm so glad that Mina's job in all of this is done, because her job was to compile the story, right? She was effectively a well-paid typist. She just had to copy everyone's notes out in triplicate, have them properly stamped, properly collated, and then presented to all of the men so that we can get on with the dirty business. He's overlooking, of course, Mina's agency in the story. It is Mina who is involved in Lucy's story. It is Mina who goes out to recover the documents, to get those first-hand accounts from, the captain of the Demeter, for example, right? It is Mina who goes to Budapest and saves Jonathan Harker's sorry ass, marries him and brings him back to England even when he is incapable of managing for himself. He has had exactly the kind of hysterical nervous breakdown, Victorian terminology, right? He has had exactly this kind of hysteria that he's worried Mina is going to have. Mina has shown no sign of it. So even before anything bad has happened, he is devaluing and sidelining her, not because she isn't great, right? This is crucially important because it's easy, I think, to misread this and to think that, I don't know, that Stoker is being either directly misogynistic himself, right? That authorially he is being dismissive of women. I think that's a harder read to get to, but certainly there are people out there who have done it. Or that he is simply asserting that the men in this story are misogynistic idiots, right? Maybe that's part of what we can pull out of this. But I don't think that is true because of the respect for Mina that is absolutely constant, right? That comes from all of these men. Just as all of these men loved Lucy, I guess. Jonathan didn't really know Lucy, but all of the other men loved Lucy, and all of these men now love Mina too, and admire her greatly. It isn't, Lucy's loveliness and femininity that wins them over here. It is Mina's forthright capability. It is her exceptional skill, right? It is her energy and brains and foresight, as Jonathan says here. The second excerpt is this, quote, this is from later, after the first biting, quote, I came tiptoe into our own room and found Mina asleep, breathing so softly that I had to put my ear down to hear it. She looks paler than usual. I hope the meeting tonight has not upset her. End quote. if you have been through the first 2/3 of the novel Dracula by the author Bram Stoker, and someone looks paler than usual, I don't think that you get to chalk it up to nerves here. I don't think you get to worry about a kind of nervous exhaustion. I think you immediately start looking for puncture wounds, don't you? Except Harker doesn't, and Seward doesn't, and Van Helsing doesn't. None of them. I've picked on Jonathan here, pulling these excerpts just from his POV, but all three of those men ignore the very obvious warning signs of what is happening to Mina because, crucially, it just isn't in their worldview. It isn't compatible with their perspective on the world. They are prejudiced, right? They do not believe that Mina is in danger because she is in a safe place, because she is in this bastion of medical science, the asylum, right? Which to us might not feel like the safest environment for her. But for, these characters, I think that they really do believe her to be safe here because it is a medical institution, because it is a scientific institution, because it is the most Victorian place that they have access to. So she is safe, and it is literally inconceivable that she should be in any danger, even when the evidence is presented to us, right? And this is important because this is, again, tying back into this idea of prejudice and blindness. The third quote here from Jonathan Harker, quote, "I am tired tonight and I want to sleep. Mina is fast asleep and looks a little too pale. Her eyes look as though she has been crying. Poor dear, I've no doubt it frets her to be kept in the dark, and it may make her doubly anxious about me and the others, but it is best as it is." End quote. Again, right? Something is wrong with Mina, and he is believing that it is about himself and the great work in which he and the other men are engaged. The irony is just so dramatic. And this, I think, to finally circle back and address Travis's question directly, I think that this is a consequence of why Stoker has these men sideline Mina, right, so effectively. We should pause to consider why it is that she is sidelined, because it is tempting to read this as a scathing assault on Victorian masculinity and Victorian gender roles in general. And Stoker, by the way, has some interesting perspectives on gender. In 1905, he writes a really interesting novel. I have not read this novel. I have only read a précis and a little, academic synopsis of this novel. But in 1905, he writes a novel called The Man, which is about a widower raising his daughter alone. The daughter is called Stephen, and he raises this daughter in a tomboyish fashion. And suffice it to say, right, it's a kind of turbulent Gothic romance of a novel, and really plays with gender roles and with the expectations there too, right? And that's 1905. It's 8 years later than Dracula, but still very much within that continuum there. Crucially, a post-Victorian novel, of course. It's an Edwardian novel by that point. So Stoker is interested in that, but here, he is presenting the men's blindness to Mina in exactly the same way as he is presenting their blindness to Dracula, except this time it's even worse because even Van Helsing is susceptible, right? Mina has a great mind. Mina has a man's mind. She has all the skills that Harker possesses and more besides. She has taken action. She has contributed, arguably, more than anyone else to the plot of this book so far. But the men are unable to see clearly. They cannot use the full power of their deductive rationality because they are blinded. And that's the root, I think, of Stoker's irony here. It's actually irrational to treat Mina this way. It's irrational to leave her in the asylum, not because the asylum is necessarily dangerous, but because she should be a part of the team, because she is at least as capable as anyone else. And if your main priority is taking down Dracula, then you should have the best team that you can with you. And this is the failing of the great Victorian superpower. But it is not a condemnation of the great Victorian superpower. It is a recognition of the limits of that power, right? We can be fairly confident that this is, I think, Stoker's intent because of the odd emphasis that is put on logical fallacies right at the beginning of this reading. This is a perfect example of what Renfield is talking about. Mina should be a part of the campaign against Dracula, cannot be refuted by, but Mina is a woman, right? That is an irrelevant conclusion. Those two things do not line up. And I'll add to this too, that Mina is respected throughout in this patronizing and condescending way, but that doesn't make her unique because Lucy is also respected. Well, remember, I was talking earlier about the chain of logical deduction that Van Helsing makes in order to lead Seward to the truth. And one of the moves that he makes there, a logical fallacy in and of itself, by the way, is the appeal to authority, right? He cites Lucy's good opinion of Van Helsing as evidence that Van Helsing is doing the right thing. I didn't pull this as a slide, but I've got the quote here. He says, And yet you saw how she thanked me, and with her so beautiful dying eyes, her voice too so weak, and she kissed my rough old hand and blessed me? Yes. And did you not hear me swear promise to her, that so she closed her eyes grateful? Yes. The men of this Scooby Gang do not dismiss these women. They don't behave as though they are misogynists, but rather they behave from this misplaced and patriarchal belief that women need to be protected. That is the prejudice. It's not a dismissal of women's capability. It is a erroneous recognition of women's fragility. That is exactly what Stoker is skewering here. And you all know that when I talk about this stuff, I'm using like big scare quotes, right? I don't need to actually do that every time because it would be exhausting and I move my hands too much when I'm talking anyway. So if I start throwing scare quotes around all of this stuff, it's going to be, I'm liable to knock things over on my desk. And as I said, this whole technical setup is pretty fragile as it is. So let's not go down that road too far. So all of this is to say, Travis, yes, I think that Dracula is an example of an early feminist text. I think it is all the more valuable too, because it doesn't just recognize the value of women. It doesn't just recognize the value, of one woman. It recognizes a spectrum of femininity, and that is unusual even in some avowedly feminist works from much later in the 20th century and even into the 21st century, right? Lucy is feminine, right? Traditionally kind of feminine and emotional and expressive and romantic, and in many adaptations and interpretations kind of sensual. She's a kind of a sensualist, right? And a good person. All of those things are true, and she is a good person. Mina is modern and capable and technically minded and rational and careful and has agency and is also a good person. These are very different types of women who not only are recognized for their own innate value by this text, but also we celebrate the bond between them. We celebrate their friendship. So yes, I'm going to say early feminist text. Absolutely. I don't know completely, like, could you skewer this entire argument by highlighting the vampire brides and their sensuality, their carnality, the association of female sexuality in particular with dark, nefarious, diabolical forces? I mean, you could take a good run at it for sure. Like I wouldn't myself, but I think you probably could build an argument that could sway some minds, right? You could indulge in some sophistry there and build a compelling argument that would maybe make this book look less feminist than I have argued it is. But ultimately, yes. And the reason that I'm spending so much time on this, in addition to the fact that Travis sent a wonderful email and I really wanted to get into the weeds on it, in addition to this, I really want this to be one of the things that we're mindful of tonight as we move through the end of the book, but much more importantly, next week and next month and next year, when you think about Dracula's position in the English canon, when you think about its place, because that, I think, is perhaps the most surprising thing about this book, and it is the thing that has been revealed to me most powerfully through this reading of the book, is that this is just so much more complex than a foundational text in the field of vampire studies, right? This isn't just about vampire lore. This is about the entire Victorian mindset. This is about the entirety of Victorian culture and the bleeding edge of modernism, right? We're so close to getting to something that is... We're so close to getting to the story that Stoker is kind of making space for through implication and omission through this epistolary format. And I find that so absolutely fascinating. I think this book has risen not just in my personal estimation as a piece of horror fiction. Again, I think Stoker's a great writer. I think his characterization is on point. I think it's extremely strong, basically throughout, particularly the first 2/3, absolutely, but pretty strong throughout. But also as a really foundational piece of genre fiction for the 20th century. You know, the whole idea of this podcast project is that we are footnoting genre fiction. I'm so interested in how these stories can be enriched. And this is the book that we have studied so far, which has come the furthest in my estimation. I'll put it that way. Which is not to say that I disliked it in the first place, just that, you know, we've really come a long way. Okay, all of that said, we have to get into what actually happens to Mina, and we have to turn back to our skill here of close reading here 50 minutes into tonight's session. Let's take a quick look at at what actually happens to Mina the third night and the bite. The moonlight was so bright that through the thick yellow blind the room was light enough to see. On the bed beside the window lay Jonathan Harker, his face flushed and breathing heavily as though in a stupor. Kneeling on the near edge of the bed, facing outwards, was the white-clad figure of his wife. By her side stood a tall, thin man, clad in black. His face was turned from us, but the instant we saw, we all recognized the Count, in every way, even to the scar on his forehead. With his left hand, he held both Mrs. Harker's hands, keeping them away from her arms at full tension. His right hand gripped her by the back of the neck, forcing her face down on his bosom. Her white nightdress was smeared with blood, and a thin stream trickled down the man's bare breast, which was shown by his torn-open dress. The attitude of the two had a terrible resemblance to a child forcing a kitten's nose into a saucer of milk to compel it to drink. As we burst into the room, the Count turned his face, and the hellish look that I had heard described seemed to leap into it. His eyes flamed red with devilish passion. The great nostrils of the white aquiline nose opened wide and quivered at the edge, and the white, sharp teeth behind the full lips of the blood-dripping mouth champed together like those of a wild beast. With a wrench, which threw his victim back upon the bed as though hurled from a height, he turned and sprang at us. By the time the professor had gained his feet, he was holding toward him the envelope which contained the sacred wafer. I will note right here, before we even get to this, that before they throw the door open, we hesitate in the hallway as Quincy wonders if it's permissible to break into a lady's room, which, again, I don't read as a joke as much as I read it as evidence of the boundaries and constraints which are in operation here, right? Something nebulous and regressive and self-defensive and self-perpetuating called society for a moment prevents the men from taking the action that they ought to take to save Mina from the monster. Now, the most compelling thing that we get here, besides, being witness to a thing that we only saw for Lucy, at a great distance, right? We only inferred the existence of this moment. For Lucy, we get to see it now in all its stark and awful and unvarnished glory. The other thing that we see here is, of course, we're echoing Lucy in the graveyard with the child, right? We're echoing this perversion of breastfeeding, and now we're taking it a step further. It is terrible to see this act of breastfeeding perverted by the creature that Lucy has become, right? The drawing of the blood from the infant into the maternal figure here, not really a maternal figure, but a stand-in maternal figure. And now it's perverted all the further by the inclusion of this male figure, right? And it's no coincidence that we're demonstrating here his masculinity, the great nostrils of his white aquiline nose opened wide and quivered at the edge, his teeth champing together like those of a wild beast. We're emphasizing his masculinity here, which makes this act of feeding that much more perverse, that much more of a twist, that much more of a subversion of expectation and a subversion of, the natural order of things as understood by the Victorian mind. It's a really powerful sequence and absolutely one of the most horrific, partly because Jonathan is there the whole time, just struck out. And I do think that is intentional too, right? I think that one of the other things that is being subverted here is the bond of marriage, right? That Harker has been incapacitated, and in his stead, in his bed, Dracula is taking possession of his wife, right? Again, we're back into very traditional gender roles here. But I do think that that's another element of this, that Stoker is invoking, that he's eliciting here to really, to trouble us in the most severe and powerful way, right? And this, we must understand, is the payoff, right? Again, to read this in sequence, we have had the dramatic irony. We have known that this is happening, even as the other characters profess ignorance, and now we crash into this moment. It's the resolution of that dramatic irony, which is always a cathartic moment in the reading experience. Let's move straight on to the next slide as we demonstrate once again that Mina knows what's up. Van Helsing and I tried to calm them both. The professor held up his golden crucifix and said with wonderful calmness, "Do not fear, my dear. We are here, and whilst this is close to you, no foul thing can approach. You are safe for tonight, and we must be calm and take counsel together." She shuddered and was silent, holding down her head on her husband's breast. When she raised it, his white nightrobe was stained with blood where her lips had touched, and where the thin, open wound in her neck had sent forth drops. The instant she saw it, she drew back with a low wail and whispered amidst choking sobs, "Unclean, unclean! I must touch him or kiss him no more. Oh, that it should be that it is I who am now his worst enemy, and whom he had the most cause to fear." To this he spoke out resolutely, "Nonsense, Mina. It is a shame to me to hear such a word. I would not hear it of you, and I shall not hear it from you. May God judge me by my deserts, and punish me with ever more bitter suffering than even at this hour, if by any act or will of mine anything ever come between us." Jonathan Harker, a good if wildly ignorant young man, because he's demonstrating here, right? Even in this hour, if by any act or will of mine anything ever come between us, he does not understand what is happening. He has not done the math in his head and kind of skipped ahead to the end of Lucy's story, and Mina has. She is smarter. She has no prejudice. And this is a crucial element of her character, right? For all of her great man's brain, the gifted man would be proud of it. For all of her woman's heart, one of the most important things about Mina is that she is really able to see the world clearly and thus apply absolute Victorian rationality, right? She is the apotheosis of this virtue that we so celebrate throughout the pages of this book. And here we see this demonstrated even in the most awful circumstance, even at her most emotionally ruinous, right? Which is a direct counterpoint to the idea that she cannot be involved in the hunt for Dracula because she will probably be hysterical. Here in this moment, is she emotionally upset? Yes, she certainly is, right? Choking sobs, whispers amidst choking sobs, unclean, unclean, I must touch him or kiss him no more. Oh, that it should be I that who am now his worst enemy and whom he have most cause to fear. Oh no, that's absolute rationality. Yes, Mina, correct. You have correctly identified your situation. You have correctly identified the consequence of this situation. You have inferred correctly everything that is going to play out from this point forward, or at least the worst version of everything that will play out from this point forward. Jonathan is still in denial, right? Van Helsing has not yet realized what the hell is going on, even though he just saw everything that we described in the previous slide. But Mina is ahead of the game. We must pick up the pace. Here we are, an hour in already. Dracula escapes. He pauses. This is a really great moment of I don't know, there's a certain pleasing friction here as Dracula pauses to destroy the documents and the phonographic cylinders from which this novel is derived. We get the brief note, of course, that there is a whole other copy in the safe. So the threat here is immediately undercut, but it is, I don't know, it does something pleasant, right? It reinforces the idea that this novel that we are reading is a found document, that it is something that has been collated in universe, as it were. Stoker really does take this further than just about anyone that I can think of in terms of the literary recreation of the found footage kind of format, as I've said before, a format of which I am really indefensibly fond. I really I have trouble articulating exactly why, as I've struggled to do so before. But Stoker really does take this idea, I think, about as far as anyone ever has, and plays with a lot of the logical, rational consequences of the epistolary format here. It's really satisfying. Let's cut ahead. Oh, we will also note now, with a glance at the time here, maybe we'll be able to circle back to Renfield right at the end, but this is the moment where, as Dracula escapes, we note that Renfield has died. His last act to try to prevent the incursion of Dracula once more into the asylum, right? He is the one who sends them off to Mina's room. He is the one that kind of gives structure to this very brief passage of the book in a way that pushes back against the idea that he's an unimportant character in the first 2/3 of the book, right? He is an incidental character in the first 2/3 of the book, but here in this moment, he is given real purpose and a tragic arc to his circumstance here. Let's move on. Let's move on to the very end of this chapter, because I really want to get to Mina recounting this horror. Quote, "When the blood began to spurt out, he took my hands in one of his, holding them tight, and with the other seized my neck and pressed my mouth to the wound so that I must either suffocate or swallow some of the... Oh my God, what have I done? What have I done to deserve such a fate? I who have tried to walk in meekness and righteousness all my days. God, pity me. Look down on a poor soul in worse than mortal peril, and in mercy pity those to whom she is dear." Then she began to rub her lips as though to cleanse them from pollution. As she was telling this terrible story, the eastern sky began to quicken, and everything became more and more clear. Harker was still and quiet, but over his face as the awful narrative went on came a grey look, which deepened and deepened in the morning light, till when the first red streak of the coming sun shot up, the flesh stood darkly out against the whitening hair. "We have arranged that one of us is to stay within call of the unhappy pair till we can meet together and arrange about taking action. Of this I am sure. The sun rises today on no more miserable house in all the great round of its daily course." And that's the end of the chapter. That's the mic drop right there. And if this chapter has forcibly taken the reins of Dracula the novel and reoriented the entire arc of the plot, then we might be compelled to forgive it, because this is excellent, right? This is so powerfully executed and delivered. All of that dramatic irony paying off in this moment of catharsis, this grief that we see here from Mina. This is the moment that I mentioned earlier, right? This moment of almost shame. Oh my God, what have I done? What have I done to deserve such a fate? And I do think that that's a crucial distinction, right? What have I done? Not what did I do with Dracula? I am ashamed of my actions, but what have I done? What have I done to deserve such a fate? I who have tried to walk in meekness and righteousness all my days. God pity me. There is something there about being, soiled, defiled, taken, right? It is an awful scene and certainly carries with it all of the emotional impact of scenes like this, of sexual assault scenes, right? Of the kind of scenes that we ought not to write irresponsibly anymore. Hey, I'm looking at you, Hollywood. But there is something more here too because of the intrusion of that dramatic irony. There is something true. It is all the worse because we saw it coming, and then it's all the worse because Mina didn't see it coming. It's all the worse because Jonathan didn't see it coming, right? We kind of get this double whammy of narrative efficacy. We get all of that foreboding, and then we also get the awful, catastrophic immediacy of the aftermath, of the payoff here. We must move on. I will actually pause here just to comment that we don't often get drama from John Seward, but when we do, I think it's very effective. The way that these paragraphs become shorter and shorter as we come down, right? The descent from this poetic language, the macabre visage of Jonathan Harker here is the flesh stood darkly out against the whitening hair as the sun comes up and illuminates this tormented soul, right? And then we've arranged that one of us is to stay within call of the unhappy pair till we can meet together and arrange about taking action. Just very clean, very, very clinical, very bluff there at the end. And then we kind of ascend back into poetry, but it is a means of like expressing a more profound guilt. Or a more profound, guilt is perhaps not completely the word for Seward, but a more profound grief maybe, right? Of this I'm sure the sun rises today on no more miserable house in all the great round of its daily course. That is a great way of concluding a chapter and sending us off with great purpose into chapter 22, where we begin. I'll note this, I didn't pull the slide for this, but we begin chapter 22, crucially, with a return to one of my favorite sub-themes of the novel, the virtue of hard work. Jonathan Harker grieves for what has happened to Mina, only to decide that the best solution is, of course, to work. Just reiterating a point now that has been made many times over the course of this novel. And then we get back to Mina, and Mina deciding that she is strong enough to die. There are here some who would stand between you and death. You must not die. You must not die by any hand, by least of all your own. Until the other who has fouled your sweet life is true dead, you must not die. For if he is still with the quick undead, your death would make you even as he is. No, you must live. You must struggle and strive to live, though death would seem a boon unspeakable. You must fight death himself, though he come to you in pain or in joy, by the day or in the night, in safety or in peril. Or your living soul, I charge you that you do not die, nay, nor think of death, till this great evil be past. The poor dear grew white as death and shook and shivered as I had seen a quicksand shake and shiver at the incoming of the tide. We were all silent. We could do nothing. At length she grew more calm, and turning to him said sweetly, but oh so sorrowfully as she held out her hand, I promise you, my dear friend, that if God will let me live, I shall strive to do so, till, if it may be in his good time, this horror has passed away from me. She was so good and brave that we all felt our hearts were strengthened to work and endure for her, and we began to discuss what we were to do. Again, kind of work as the great panacea there at the end, right? Okay. Whew, we're strengthened. Now we can work. That will make things better. Work will make things better. A couple quick moments of kind of reflection here, right? Again, playing with a little kind of irony here from Stoker. Do not die, do not even think of death. And what happens at his words? She turns pale as death. The poor dear grew white as death and shook and shivered as I have seen a quicksand shake and shiver at the incoming of the tide, which is a weird simile, right? That's a weird point of comparison there for Seward to make, but it's really about the repetition of the word quick, I think, that we're getting. If he is still with the quick undead, right? And then the quicksand. Quick here meaning alive, right? That is why quicksand is called quicksand, is that it moves as though it is alive. It moves as though it is intentional, right? The Highlander and the quickening, right? It is this living quality that we are imparting to something. The quick undead, as great a name as that would be for a cowboy vampire movie, I guess. The quick undead is yes, the alive undead, right? He's kind of drawing that comparison, that contrast, right? To be undead is not to be alive, but we're talking about the quality of being alive because we're talking about the necessity of Dracula's death. That Mina here, who is already at this point has accepted the inevitability, in fact, of her own final demise, has accepted the inevitability of terminal action being taken against her, just as it was taken against Lucy, and the necessity of that action here being, forced to stay alive, forced to continue onward, to really reject, to actively strive against the temptation of death. And you'll note how Van Helsing presents that here, right? And you'll remember, in an era where suicide is absolutely frowned upon, where suicide is completely immoral, right? We've already covered the grave of the suicide back in Whitby, so we know that is not an okay thing for a good person to do. But we acknowledge here the idea that death himself might come to you in pain or in joy, by day or by night, in safety or in peril. There is now a specter out there, and you have to fight it all the time, which is in its own way a kind of rejection of prejudice, right? It is in its own way an incitement to look at the world as it really is, right? Don't be lulled by these logical fallacies of safety and comfort, or equally by the fallacies of pain and torment and suffering. None of these things are real, and none of these things should cloud your judgment. You should see clearly, you should see cleanly, and you should fight death at every turn, or what will happen is much worse than death. That's what Van Helsing is laying out here. And we should note, too, just how good this dilemma is, narratively speaking, right? If Mina becomes a threat to the people that she loves, she will seek her own death. But if Mina dies, then she will become a much worse threat to the people she loves. That is tight. And we've locked it off chronologically because we have to contend with the death of Dracula. We have to somehow bring him down before time runs out for Mina. It's a good old-fashioned time lock, y'all, as Quincy P. Morris would undoubtedly say. I'm sure he says. That's actually not true, is it? Quincy Morris does not say y'all in the course of this book. I'm pretty sure. If Quincy Morris says y'all in this book, please take a snapshot of it and send it to me at the email address starsandswordspod@gmail.com, and I will, I don't know, high-five you. I will send you a digital high-five, and how COVID has changed the world. I will send you a digital high-five, and we'll behave like that's a real thing. Then we're back to the procedural, and this is really where this part of the book kind of loses some momentum. But also kind of, this is not to suggest that Stoker is not a good writer. Stoker is choosing to do something with a great deal of care and intentionality, and it is just not a thing that I think reads as compellingly to the modern mind. And though I am mounting here an extended defense of the last act of Dracula, I'm also acknowledging, I think, that the last act of Dracula is its least successful act. We're going to really kind of come up on some sandy shoals here. We're going to beach this narrative craft on the shoals rather than making clean, smooth progress forward. So we raid Carfax, we destroy the house in Piccadilly, so on and so forth. We search and hunt across the city. Before they leave, Van Helsing attempts to ward Mina with the sacred wafer, which is a weird moment. It's a strange choice. There's some weird stuff about Catholicism here that I just can't. I've got a lot of Catholicism in my head because of the Francis Ford Coppola movie, which reimagines everyone in England during the Victorian era as good, faithful Catholics, which is weird, frankly. It's kind of a typically Coppelian intrusion into the text, a colonialism at work here, right? He colonizes the text with his own worldview, which is the thing that I think Coppola is wont to do. Anyway, bonus episode on Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula coming out tomorrow. In fact, as of this recording, I'm going to record that tomorrow night and release it probably fairly late tomorrow evening. So that'll be an accompaniment to your pre-Christmas weekend here as you're moving toward the holidays and the festivities. You get to listen to me talk about Francis Ford Coppola for an hour. I know that's what we all want. The point is this, though. The sacred wafer scars Mina, and it's significant in two ways. One of which is symbolic, right? It matches the scar on Dracula's head, too. And, well, I guess in three ways, right? It matches the scar on Dracula's head. It demonstrates that Mina is now definitely under the influence of something, right? We're not just speculating. We don't just have the proof of the blood. We now have some evidence that she has been contaminated actively by something, which may be the point of Van Helsing's test, I'm not sure that I completely buy Van Helsing trying to guard her and ward her through the application of the sacred wafer, capital S, capital W, which I find inexplicably amusing. I don't know. It's a Stokerism, right? In Catholic circles, we do not capitalize the W, right? So I myself am not a Catholic. In Catholic circles, the W is not capitalized. It is a sacred, lowercase w, wafer. The wafer is not the thing that makes it special. Its sanctity is the thing that makes it special, right? The transubstantiated body of Christ. But here, yeah, the capitalization of the S and the W for some reason strikes me as funny. I can go no further down that road than that. And you can hear my voice giving up here. A mere 70 minutes into our evening. I need to work on my constitution here, clearly. So yes, it scars Mina. It proves that Mina is under the sway of something fell and malign, but it also crucially provides narrative momentum for Jonathan and Mina and Van Helsing. They all, at some point within the next chapter or two, are going to be reminded, they're all going to be tempted to give up and then be reminded by the scar on Mina's forehead that actually there are stakes here. Actually, there's something objective that you can look at without having to describe Mina as being, pale, or her lips drawing back from elongated white teeth, or any of the usual signs and harbingers of vampiric conquest, right? Thereafter, Van Helsing offers another account of Dracula. Okay. I haven't pulled any of this stuff, you guys. I haven't pulled any of Van Helsing's extremely long and detailed and internally contradictory accounts of Dracula, right? We get the great moment where Renfield invites him into the asylum. For example, I'm cherry picking one example out of, I'm not kidding, 20 here. We get the great moment when Renfield invites Dracula into the asylum, thus offering up Mina as a prize, albeit somewhat inadvertently, right? And then Van Helsing comes back to say, obviously he has to be invited in. This is part of like the vampiric lore. This is really where we get the lore dump that will form our vampire mythology for the next century and a half, right? Not quite at a half yet, but more than a century after the publication of this original novel. And it contradicts things that have come. In what way was he invited in to Lucy's home by the smashing of the window and the strewing of the garlic by the head of Berserker the Wolf? How, in what way was that an invitation, right? And if he was previously invited, why did he have to come through the window with the head of Berserker the Wolf, right? Why did we have to go through that approach rather than presumably another more simple and straightforward approach? It doesn't seem to really fit together. And again, I've praised Stoker in previous episodes in this series for not giving into the desire for Victorian comprehensitivity, right? Not necessarily giving into the idea that every single thing must be accounted for and clearly delineated. I've talked about the ways in which Stoker is kind of foreshadowing the rise of early modern 20th century horror in these specific ways. But there are some contradictions. There are some contradictions in this part of the book. We get the date wrong, right? Which isn't important, but the date that is given for Dracula booking passage on the ship back to Varna, which we're going to get to in just a moment, that date is just wrong. It's a day late. It's incorrect. It should be the day earlier. And there's no acknowledgement of that within the text. And I've been very generous previously in the book, right? Like Lucy's weird letter that Lucy could not possibly have written, right? Reassuring Mina that everything's okay, which is for some reason included in this bundle of documents, despite the fact that it stands at odds with Arthur's account of the same period. I'm here for that. That's rich and it's rewarding and it suggests, it enriches our understanding of this text. It creates space for speculation. It does feel as though in the absence of a unifying tension that some of the threads are kind of going astray here right at the end of the book. And also that Stoker is just, I think, kind of reevaluating what a vampire is as he moves forward, right? He's kind of coming up with better ideas. Maybe if this book had been serialized, we might not think of it in quite the same way. Let's move on here. We're going to skip to the greater point. Dracula's defeat in London is secured through the application of logic and the rational method, right? It is this progressive scientific approach to the investigation that secures our victory in London. It is the tools of the modern world, and this is only going to be emphasized all the more when we get to the actual end of the book, right? But it is the tools of modernity. It is the telegraph, and it is a catalog of records. It is good, solid documentation, and the orderly functioning of a well-maintained modern city. This is what yields victory against Dracula and drives him out of London with a real villain monologue moment right there too. Hopeless. So yes, to recap, just in case you haven't read, he then vanishes from London with a single crate remaining of his Transylvanian earth. All the others have been smashed. He has one remaining and he flees we know not where. And it seems for a moment hopeless. And I think that Stoker manages to manage this rise and fall of emotional tension really quite beautifully. But once again, who steps in? Mina steps in, because that's what Mina does. Mina comes in with a suggestion. Yes, here we are. That she be hypnotized. Quote, "In 2 or 3 minutes later, Van Helsing was in the room in his dressing gown, and Mr. Morris and Lord Godalming were here with Dr. Seward at the door, asking questions. When the professor saw Mina, a positive smile, ousted the anxiety of his face. He rubbed his hands as he said, 'Oh, my dear Madam Mina, this is indeed a change. See, friend Jonathan, we have got our dear Madam Mina, as of old, back to us today.' Then turning to her, he said cheerfully, 'And what am I to do for you? For at this hour you do not want me for nothings.' 'I want you to hypnotize me,' she said. 'Do it before the dawn, for I feel that I can speak and speak freely. Be quick, for the time is short.' I don't, sadly, have time to do a full overview of the history of hypnotism and its roots in mesmerism, right? Briefly, the term hypnotism is neurohypnotism. In fact, is coined by the Scottish surgeon James Braid in 1842, developed from earlier ideas derived from the work of Austrian physician Franz Mesmer, right? This is where we get mesmerism as a concept. It gains traction in the 1880s in France. The first International Congress for Experimental and Therapeutic Hypnotism is held in Paris on the 8th to the 12th of August, 1889. So it is, like everything else that we're dealing with in this part of the novel, cutting edge. It is the modern world. It is as though we were vampire hunters armed with drones and Roombas and TikTok, right? We are right the way. I just said 3 things that are all like at least a decade old. I don't know, whatever the kids are using these days. But we are right up to date. We are using the most cutting edge technologies in our pursuit of the vampire. And this is not just a celebration of the modern miracle that is the Victorian world. It's more deep than that. It's thematic, right? It is the conquering of the old by the new. It is very specifically the refutation of the Gothic genre as a whole, right? We talked about this back when we were doing Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, and of course we talked about it a little right at the beginning of our unit on Dracula. Gothic literature, the Gothic form, is about the intrusion of the past into the present, right? The past will not remain buried. That's why we think of Gothic architecture. It's why we think of graveyards. It's why we think of, ghosts and revenants and the unquiet dead. Those are the hallmarks of Gothic literature because they are actual physical examples of the past intruding onto the present. But this story is about the present murdering the past with modernity. That is what we do. This is the modern world will actually conquer and uproot all that came before it and make the world anew. It will make the world clean, right? It is a counter-argument to the Gothic tradition here. Let's keep moving forward. Yes, so obviously we've got Mina here again, right? Just the smartest, most capable person in the room. Van Helsing, kind of, maybe not completely unforgivable, right? He's just been woken before dawn with great urgency. He comes into the room in his dressing gown, but what does he say? "Oh, my dear Madam Mina, this is indeed a change." She's back to normal. Madam Mina looks like Madam Mina once more. And we're not acknowledging that it's dawn, right? We've seen this happen. We saw it happen with Lucy. Van Helsing seemed to have some knowledge of it when it was happening to Lucy. We've seen it happen to Renfield too. Dawn and dusk are particularly significant. And here he's not getting it. He's not able to engage as fully as we might want him to, as fully as we might expect him to, honestly, given the Van Helsing that we've seen previously in this book. But Mina is on it. Mina is up to the task and is doing a beautiful job. What's interesting here, I suppose, is the psychic link, right? I'm hesitant to even get into this because we get so little of it that it's more difficult to account for than most of the book, and a lot of this book is pretty difficult to account for, right? The actual mechanics of the supernatural as it's presented to us here. There is an association, I think, between the sharing of the blood between Mina and Dracula and the forging of the psychic connection between the two, right? She has this ability under hypnosis. At dawn, at dusk, when his power over her is at its weakest, she can access his sensorium, right? She can experience what he is experiencing for a moment. And this, as we learn, is reciprocal. You have to read it a couple times to understand, that it's a surprise to them that it's reciprocal, right? Because I think that we, from a modern perspective, we've seen stories like this 1,000 times, and the trick is always, oh no, I can see you too, right? It's maybe they were forced dyad, right? It's Kylo Ren and Rey all over again. I don't remember if she has a surname. I don't think it's ever come up or proved its importance. But what we see here as we move through this part of the story is Mina really taking charge of the narrative, taking charge of the psychic connection, taking charge of her own being, right? That's why she asks to be hypnotized, is the understanding that as Dracula's power wanes, she is able to fully access herself in a way that she can't even as normal Mina, right? That is why hypnotism is so popular in the Victorian era, is because it allows us dubiously, right? Again, not actual science, but Victorian science, which is almost the same thing. It allows us to unearth the great wealth of knowledge from our unconscious or subconscious minds, right? It allows us to most fully access our own internal rationality, our own internal stores of wisdom. Again, dubious. But Mina is on top of it and can guide us here. She leads us to the ship, which leads the team to the docks. We go off to investigate. Jonathan stays behind with Mina. This is where we get this moment where, we can feel that Dracula has gone, right? This miasmatic influence of Dracula has now declined, and he starts to relax for a moment. In fact, did I pull the... I don't have the slide of this, but I did pull the quote. For my own part, now that this horrible danger is not face-to-face with us, it seems almost impossible to believe in it. Even my own terrible experiences in Castle Dracula seem like a long-forgotten dream. Here in the crisp autumn air and the bright sunlight, alas, how can I disbelieve? In the midst of my thought, my eye fell on the red scar on my poor darling's white forehead. Here again, the scar, right? The physical manifestation of this contamination, which isn't otherwise physically evident yet, right? And maybe, it's occurring to me now that maybe that is what is intended with Van Helsing's, sleepy time wake up. Oh, Mina, you look great. You're fantastic. Because Dracula's already gone, right? This is immediately preceding the dash to the docks, which means that he caught the boat the day before. He has left England. He has already departed. So maybe we can account for that. Maybe we can give Van Helsing the benefit of the doubt here that he too is experiencing a kind of forgetfulness, right? In the absence of Dracula, in the absence of this miasmatic effect, you begin to forget. Your brain starts to smooth over some of these experiences, and maybe in time they would be gone entirely. It's not something that we really delve into in the course of the book, but it's an interesting thought nonetheless. I know that we're running terribly late, but I can't go on without pulling what I think is Bram Stoker's best joke. What I think is the funniest part of the book, and it is a part of the book that is consciously and deliberately funny, not on the part of Van Helsing, but definitely on the part of Stoker, right? We've seen already how Stoker loves to play with accent, right? We've had Yorkshire and Cockney. We're going to have Scottish. I have not pulled a slide of the captain of the Demeter, not the captain of the Demeter, excuse me, the captain of the Tsarina Katerina, because I can't do that. My forefathers would be uneasy in their graves were I to defoul the Scots language with what Stoker has written there. But we love his play with accents. We love it almost as much as he clearly does. And then we get an example of an idiomatic version of this with Van Helsing relating the story of his trip to the docks and meeting with the captain of the Tsarina Katerina, right? This is the with Bloom and Blood, from which we drew the title of tonight's session. This is a small sample of the imitative account given to us by Van Helsing. Whereupon the captain tells me he had better be quick with blood, for that his ship will leave the place of blood before the turn of the tide with blood. Then the thin man smiled and said that of course he must go when he think fit, but he will be surprised if he go quite so soon. The captain swear again, polyglot, and the thin man make him bow and thank him and say that he will so far intrude on his kindness as to come aboard before the sailing. Final, the captain, more red than ever and in more tongues, tell him that he doesn't want no Frenchman with bloom upon him and also with blood in his ship, with blood on her also. And so, after asking where there might be close at hand a shop where he might purchase ship forms, he departed. This is just, it's so stupid, but it's so great. And again, I love the confidence with which Stoker approaches this to not just give us this excerpt, but 2 full pages of this. It's so deep in Van Helsing's voice. It's so rich. I think it's such Again, just a fantastic demonstration of Stoker's skill with characterization and with idiomatic language. What is happening here, to those of you who maybe aren't following, is that Van Helsing is trying to render in his ungainly English the common swear words used by British sailors, right? Bloody and blooming, right? Respectively. He doesn't want no Frenchmen with bloom upon them and also with blood, right? No bloody, blooming Frenchmen, no blooming, bloody Frenchmen aboard his ship, also with blood, right? I don't want no bloody, blooming Frenchman aboard my bloody ship. Very common swear words that really are, in some parts of England, interspersed that frequently into one's dialogue, particularly as one becomes riled, right? Particularly as one becomes agitated. Certainly he doesn't use this language against Van Helsing and Quincy Morris, partly because Quincy Morris, of course, has slipped him some folding money in order to secure his attention through this. There's really nothing else here, right, except for the account. It really is a comic relief moment. I think it works. I would love to know if it works for you guys. I would love to know if is this just awful? Am I out on a limb here enjoying this part of the book? Please get in touch and let me know. We retire for the night thereafter. Mina mirrors Jonathan, right? We have the recapitulation of that scene. She too sees her scar in the mirror this time and is reminded that this is not in fact over. And now we're really going to pick up because there's not that much left in the book, you guys. This is basically its last movement, and it's worth looking, I think, as a reflection of the opening, right? We look back at those first 4 chapters and we see Jonathan Harker, well-intentioned young Englishman. He goes out into the world with a somewhat condescending attitude, but also kind of an open mind. He goes out on business. He carries with him a shroud of modernity, certainly, a shroud of professionalism, certainly, but he also enters into the older world, right? He doesn't seek to overcome it or to subvert it, right? He's enjoying the dishes loaded with paprika. He's worried about, train times. They aren't as reliable as they were further west, but still he goes into it with a kind of open heart and experiences the world. And now we see a kind of a counterpoint to that. We see kind of an inversion of that, right? The evil is defeated in England and driven out of England by the application of good old-fashioned English diligence, right? Victorian rationalism and care here. But then, crucially, we return to the darkness of the Carpathian Mountains. We return to the Black Sea. We return to Eastern Europe. And we do it with a great deal of intent because now we are wielding that diligence. We're wielding that rational approach. We're wielding that modernity like a weapon, right? We are coming back and we are bringing trains and Winchesters and everything that we need to secure final victory over this monster. It is deliberate, it is penetrative, it is a conquest, right? Van Helsing expresses concerns over the Count's ability to read Mina's mind, right? Once again, kind of acknowledging the reciprocal nature of this psychic link. We have... I have to do this. I was going to skip this slide in the interests of efficiency, but we can't. We absolutely have to do it because it's time for another conversation about excluding Mina from the proceedings. Then what we must do is prevent this. We must keep her ignorant of our intent, and so she cannot tell what she know not. This is a painful task, oh, so painful that it heartbreak me to think of, but it must be. When today we meet, I must tell her that for reason which we will not to speak, she must not more be of our counsel, but be simply guided by us. He wiped his forehead, which had broken out in a profuse perspiration at the thought of the pain which he might have to inflict upon the poor soul already so tortured. I knew that it would be of some comfort to him if I told him that I had already come to the same conclusion. For any rate, it would take away the pain of doubt. I told him, and the effect was as I expected. So we're back, right? Second time, just like the first. Second time, third time, I don't know. We've done this a few times, but there is a crucial difference because this time, Mina agrees. In fact, she demands from Jonathan a promise that he will exclude her from the planning process, thereby validating Van Helsing's earlier decision. Again, this is Stoker emphasizing that there's nothing wrong with the rational process, that the rational process is all we've got in a world gone mad, right? All we can do is logically deduce the next step. We have to move forward with informed purpose. But we have to be willing to look at the situation objectively. And when we see the situation objectively, we will reach the proper rational conclusion. We ought to keep Mina in the dark because Mina is a woman? Nah, that's flawed. That's logically fallacious. That's not where we should be. We have to keep Mina in the dark because Dracula is living in her brain and will hear our super secret plans? No, actually, that's good, right? Everyone agrees that that is the good and rational response to this information. This is Stoker, again, kind of drawing this very clean dividing line that It's not about magic over science, right? You tell this story now in 2024, and that would be an absolutely expected and predictable kind of thematic opposition, right? Magic versus science. It's about faith versus rationalism, right? It's about the old world, the richness and the power of the old world versus the thin and insubstantial modern world. Stoker's doing, and we have to be very clear on this, none of that. That is not his intent. Stoker absolutely believes in the modern world. He absolutely believes in the conquest of Victorian values and the Victorian version of modernity, right? He believes that these things are the best things that we have to offer. But we have to be open to the world. We cannot allow our prejudice to blind us. And this is where he rewards Van Helsing, right? This is the pat on the head for Van Helsing for wanting to exclude Mina earlier in the book and being wrong. Now he wants to exclude Mina and is immediately validated, first by Seward and then, most importantly, by Mina herself. The prejudice is the problem. We get this touching moment where we read the burial service to Mina, kind of trying to set her soul to some kind of peace, regardless of what comes next. There's a great moment actually at the end of that passage where for the first time Seward's voice fails him, right? This is the transcript of his phonographic recording, and he hesitates and falters, and we see it transcribed very carefully, very perfectly. Another great example of Stoker playing with the epistolary form at a time when audio recording was by no means common, right? He's really anticipating a movement in found footage storytelling that really won't be practiced for decades after this novel. So we move on. We take the modern miracle of the Orient Express, supported by the modern miracles of the telegraph and hypnosis also for information, right? We're absolutely on the cutting edge of what is available to the Victorian world. The fastest train in the world, and the telegraph, and hypnotism, and Winchester repeating rifles. And then we build this plan, which again kind of conspicuously, and now that I have put it in my head that maybe we can forgive some of the softness in the planning in this part of the book, if we can attribute some of that to the fact that Dracula's influence is now no longer localized, it's no longer immediate, it's no longer present, I'm kind of wanting to move toward a reinterpretation of this and maybe treat it a little more gently. But the fact is that we are making a plan to arrive in Varna and accost this ship, the Tsarina Katerina, right, named for Catherine the Great, of course, that we're going to accost the ship with no recollection of what happened to the Demeter at Whitby, with no, acknowledgement that the arrival of the ship might not, in fact, be normal. We're just forgetting that ever happened and moving forward as though we have everything on lock. We then arrive, of course, in Varna. We learn that the Tsarina Katerina arrives in Galatz in Romania, 200 miles to the north. Luckily, there was a train. Double luckily, Mina the Modern Miracle herself has memorized all the train timetable, like every train timetable in the world? Is that what? I understand her wanting to support her husband. All the time. I mean, okay, we can take it. I wouldn't believe it possible of anyone but the magnificent Madame Mina, alternate title for tonight's session. The following day, Harker and the others interview Captain Donaldson, the aforementioned Scottish captain. I'm sorry, I'm not going to get into this wild interpretation of a Scots accent here. The superstition of foreigners is perfectly ridiculous. Wow, you got to go a long way to get that to work. We're back to Bloofer, right? I don't know how you get there. I can say it no more clearly than this. I don't know how you get there. I don't know how that is the word that you write down as a permutation of a word that you know is actually real in the real world. Some of this is so acute and some of it baffling to me. We get some surprising, some genuinely shocking and casual and fleeting, but also still very shocking anti-Semitism from Jonathan Harker to remind us that it is still 1897 and he is still an Englishman. And then we get the actual rational, logical, procedural process that we've been discussing this whole time, right? We get the actual accounting of it in Mina's memorandum. She actually lays out the deductive process for us to see. We arrive at our destination. We're getting really close. We're going to forcibly skip ahead here because we do need to wrap up, and we need to wrap up with a certain amount of intent, right? And all of this, to be fair, plays out pretty quickly. Some of it is well written, some of it is engaging, some of it is evocative, right? It's rich. I'm never not going to be disappointed by Van Helsing's slaying of the vampire brides. I think that is, and partly that's just because, you know, I myself have lived for a century with, I have lived for a century in the shadow of Dracula. I have not lived for a century. I have lived in the century that falls under the shadow of Dracula. And I just want there to be more. I think that the detail of the vampire brides is so rich that to get to the end and realize that what Stoker had intended with them was basically nothing is a little frustrating. To hand their vanquishing to Van Helsing too, right? Not Jonathan, right? We're not like interested in his personal history, the personal accounting of that. It is a little procedural. It is a little flat. It is a little direct. It is a little linear, is what I will say about some of this at the ending. And then, of course, we have the climax, the anticlimax, dare I suggest. But there's almost no way for it to not be an anticlimax, right? There's almost no way for it to be. You're not going to get a rich and rewarding boss fight. You're not going to get like a you know, final session of the D&D campaign standoff against the villain while he cackles maniacally and hurls lightning bolts at you, because what we have done deliberately and structurally within this novel is take the massed might of the Victorian modern world and pushed it against a guy in a box. Like there's no sense of comparable scale here anymore, right? So complete is the dominance, right? We have overcome it. I'm kind of revising this thought as I'm having it, as you can tell, I'm sure. It becomes in the end a kind of man versus nature story rather than a man versus man story, right? This is not about a protagonist and an antagonist. This is about individuals overcoming their own personal limitations so that they can then effectively overcome the natural world, the natural opposition, right? We have to resolve our differences so that we can work together and climb that mountain. We have to resolve our differences so that we can work together and cure this disease. We have to solve our differences and work together so that we can slay this one vampire. And that's kind of how it goes. I'm not even particularly satisfied with the death of Quincy Morris, honestly. Like, I enjoy that he gets the killing blow. I like that we're leaning so much on his aggressive nature, on his swaggering, right? And every time we get his swagger, every time we're like, I'm gonna find that son of a bitch and I'm gonna stab him. That Van Helsing will pat him and say, "Good boy, brave boy. Yes, Quincy is the most man of any of us." And of course, it is the most man of any of us. But he is also like a warning, right? Because the American is too modern. The American is too reckless, because for all of our rush to embrace modernity here in in Victorian England, we're also very connected to tradition. These things exist in a balance, right? We will introduce new technology and we will renew our world, but we're doing it with the perspective of generations of entrenched power, right? We're coming from power structures that are themselves ancient. America is too modern, and this is what happens when things get too modern. From there, and I must rush through this just a little as we can wrap up tonight already over time, we get Harker's little epilogue, right? From several years later, he announces that he and Mina have a baby boy. I love this line about his bundle of names links all our little band of men together, but we call him Quincy. Is actually, I think, very touching, right? I love the idea that this kid's name is, what would it be? Quincy Arthur John Abraham Harker, right? Is that, how would you formulate that? What is the most mellifluous formulation of all of those names together? Do we include like Lucy? Do we include any other abstract? Berserker? Is Berserker in there? Is the kid's third middle name Berserker? If it's not, why not? These are the questions that we must answer here. Demeter, right? Are we using all of these words? God, Demeter Berserker Harker would be maybe the most powerful name in the world, right? That guy's going to have a future ahead of him. But then this is the absolute end of the book. Quote, "When we got home, we were talking of the old time, which we could all look back on without despair, for Godalming and Seward are both happily married. I took the papers from the safe where they had been ever since our return so long ago. We were struck with the fact that in all the mass of material of which the record is composed, there was hardly one authentic document. Nothing but a mass of typewriting, except the later notebooks of Mina and Seward and myself and Van Helsing's memorandum. We could hardly ask anyone, even if we did wish to accept these as proofs of so wild a story. Van Helsing summed it all up as he did with our boy on his knee. We want no proofs. We ask none to believe us. This boy will someday know what a brave and gallant woman his mother is. Already he knows her sweetness and loving care. Later on, he will understand how some men so loved her that they did dare much for her sake." And that's the end of Dracula. And it's satisfying on one level for Mina to be the primary focus of this ending, right? This is after they have gone back to Transylvania. This is after they have kind of taken in the land, right? Again, armed now with modernity, we have gone back and found actually the shadows were not so bad. Though also, parenthetically, are the shadows not so bad because Dracula has been killed and that miasma that we've been talking about through this entire unit has now finally begun to fade years later? It's satisfying that Mina is the focal point of this excursion. I love we could all look back on without despair, for Godalming and Seward are both happily married. The one thought there isn't completely in alignment with the other thought, unless you just accept that no, actually everybody fell hard in love with Mina. All of these men just really devoted. They fall in love en masse is the thing. Right? Any one of them falls and they all fall, as they did for Lucy, as they did for Mina. And then we get the mass of this material, right? There is some of it presumably, well, it's hard to tell, right? Because we don't know. We know that Dracula destroyed one version of the account, but we don't know which version of the account. We don't know if this version still contains the actual clipping taken from the newspaper by Mina in Whitby, for example, right? Or the actual translation of the journal entry of the captain of the Demeter, the logbook of the captain of the Demeter. We don't know if that's the original or if these are the transcriptions which Mina created, which she typewrote so beautifully here. But what's most interesting about this is its active refutation of the author's note. You remember all the way back in the beginning? I should have pulled this on a slide just so that we would have it here. But the author's note at the beginning assures us that, in fact, all of this documentary evidence has been assembled by people who were present at the time, and thus there can be no space for speculation or doubt. This is a true account. And now even here at the end of this account, Van Helsing says, no one's going to believe it. You know, it's just all put together. It's just an assembled transcription of documents, right? They've been typewritten out like they were, I don't know, a novel that you would buy in a store with a red cover with Bram Stoker's name written on the front of it. No one's going to believe that it's true, regardless of what the author's note says at the beginning. And this is absolutely definitive proof that Stoker is playing games with us with that author's note. I spent some time on this back in the first session. I know, not the introductory, but the first full session, talking about the author's note, talking about the way that the Victorian reader, the 1897 contemporary reader, is already familiar with epistolary novels, and you do not need to introduce them. You certainly don't need to introduce the like defining characteristic of the epistolary novel to this new reader as though it is a novel phenomenon, and you certainly don't need to undercut it constantly as we move through the book with letters which don't quite line up and obviously, you know, skewed after the fact reports, right? We don't need to assure the reader that everything here is true, particularly if we're going to conclude the book by saying, no one's ever going to believe it, and it doesn't really matter, right? We want no proofs. We ask none to believe us, right? In direct contrast to the author's note at the beginning of the book. We ask none to believe us. What is important? This boy will someday know what a brave and gallant woman his mother is. Already he knows her sweetness and loving care. Right? You see the distinction there? He already knows her feminine heart. He already knows her woman's heart. He will someday know her man's mind too. Right? This great gifted man's mind that Mina possesses. He will come to apprehend both sides of this. Heads later, for now just hearts, to quote the excellent and very wise TV show, Bluey. This is the end of the book. I mean, it's not quite the end of the book, because there is... I was talking about Van Helsing laying out all of the many details of the vampire as we come to understand him in this part of the book as contrasted with the earlier parts of the book. And there is a real open question. There is a whole school of speculative thought about what happens in Romania, right? Does Dracula actually die? Because none of the things that we have been told to expect from the death of a vampire happen. He is not staked. He is not beheaded. The mouth is not filled with garlic. All the way through, we're told that's how you do it. That's how you kill a vampire. That is, crucially, not what happens. Is it a trick? Is it Stoker just simply reevaluating? I find it, on the one hand, so thrilling and rewarding that there is this ambiguity about the final dramatic moment of this plot with no lampshade shone upon it, right? Nothing lampshade shone upon it, with no lampshade hung upon it, no lamp shone upon it, right? With no emphasis put on that moment. There is still a subtle ambiguity for those who have been paying attention, and this is a book that rewards those who have been paying attention with subtle ambiguities, right? As we've seen throughout our reading here. So is Dracula dead? Did he feign to flee, right? Is he borrowing the Sauron playbook there? Is he escaping somehow to retreat into Dol Guldur and rebuild his power, and getting that the other way around of Dol Guldur into Mordor there for Sauron, of course. But right, is he fleeing and he will rebuild his power? Are we supposed to read this as ominous? Are we supposed to read it as ambiguous even? Or is this Stoker just kind of throwing out the end of this book with the best idea that he had at the time? That is a question for the ages. That is a question for adaptation. Certainly, it is a question for those who want to venture forth and continue to write stories happening in this world, in this continuity. We have to wrap up, you guys. An hour and 45 minutes. I'm getting very close to the actual practical time limit of this podcast. That is going to do it for this episode. That is going to do it for our discussion of Dracula, which, as I think you can tell, I have so thoroughly enjoyed. I have really loved. It was supposed to be 4 sessions, forestalled for a month by illness. It turned into 8 sessions, most of which have been double the length of a normal session of Stars and Swords. And I will say, I like this. I like this space. I've heard from a lot of you that you also like this space. So this is more what we are going to be doing going forward. And thank God, because we have a task ahead of us. I've got to tell you, we have to look at, let me call up our new revised schedule here. No time to rest upon our laurels. No time to recover from our trip to Transylvania, because next week we are venturing into Prince Caspian, the second book in the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. Conveniently, Prince Caspian breaks very tidily into 15 chapters, so we are just going to cover 5 chapters every week. It has a very pleasant, structured approach to storytelling, as a direct contrast to the works of Abraham Stoker, for sure. So we're going to cover 5 chapters every week. That's the 19th and 26th of December, and then the 2nd of January, assuming that I am recovered from Hogmanay. We'll see how that all goes. That will be followed by the first episode on the Silmarillion, which, let's be honest, will not even include, I'm not even going to promise a reading that week. That is going to be an introductory session. We're going to talk about what the Silmarillion is, both in universe and out. We're going to talk about its composition. We're going to talk about its collation. We're going to talk about this titanic academic achievement by Christopher Tolkien, who is so often overlooked as a serious academic and a serious contributor to our literary heritage here, right? Our understanding and appreciation of the works of his father are so much richer because of the work of an entire lifetime. Christopher Tolkien really dedicated himself to this task and did a beautiful job. And it's because of him that we have the Silmarillion. So I'm really looking forward to delving into that, the introductory session there. And then we'll lay out a framework for how we are going to cover the Silmarillion. I'm anticipating a long time. We're probably not going to get through as many units next year as we have this year, because it's about a year, right? We're a little past the 1-year anniversary of Stars and Swords. And is this our 8th? I think I said it at the beginning of today's session. Is it? I have now neglected to recall. Yeah, it's our 8th unit. So Prince Caspian will be our 9th, and then appropriately enough, the Silmarillion will be our 10th. The bonus episode for Francis Ford Coppola's 1992 Bram Stoker's Dracula will, as I say, be recorded tomorrow and probably released tomorrow too. That will be Friday the 13th of December, possibly bleeding into Saturday the 14th, depending on how late I get to sit down and start recording it and how long I run when I am talking about it. I have opinions, you guys. And then I'm also going to be dropping a bonus episode over on the Patreon page sometime around the 28th or 29th, I'm thinking, of December, somewhere in that holiday interregnum there, looking at the 2008 adaptation of Prince Caspian, a movie which is not good, but a movie which is good. We're going to talk about it when we get there. I'm really looking forward to discussing that book as a whole and even that movie adaptation too. Less successful than The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, but still a lot to interest us, a lot to compel us, particularly in terms of expanded world building, right? A lot of what was fairy tale in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe has now become fantasy in Prince Caspian, and that distinction is crucial. We're really going to get an opportunity to delve deep into that book in the weeks to come. Thank you so much for joining me for the Dracula unit. Thank you so much for your patience as we have taken so long to finish the Dracula unit. I hope you're as excited about what comes next as I am. If you would like to support me here, if you would like to join me here for these live sessions, I should say too, head on over to the Patreon page, patreon.com/nextword. You can just sign up there to follow me for free. You don't have to do anything. I don't think you even have to put in like a credit card number or anything like that. You can just follow me for free, and you will get the posts featuring the live link so that you can join me usually on a Thursday evening, but we might try and move that around a little bit, particularly over the holidays. We'll see how availability works out. But you can join me here live and ask questions in the live chat, and I'll be able to interact with you a little before and a little after the whole proceeding too. That's going to do it, I think. Also, you can head over to patreon.com/nextword and pledge actual dollar support so that I can continue doing this and do more. That's all we want, right? do more. That's going to do it, you guys. I'm absolutely bloody exhausted. So I'm exhausted with blood and blooming. That's going to do it for this week's session. That's going to do it for Dracula. That's going to do it for Stars and Swords. Thank you so much for listening. I will talk to you all again next week with Prince Caspian. Until then, take care. Thanks.